Labour are trying to say they need to reform public services. That costs money, and actually, you have to do an upfront capital spend to do the nice, bien pensant liberal things they want to do, and they're dodging that question.
Well, let's start off with the riots because, of course, that has dominated the news agenda. We've talked about it a lot. Anne, I'll start with you. Where do you feel things are this sort of Friday? Things feel that they've calmed down a bit, but the Prime Minister's very keen to press the message that we're not out of the woods yet.
I think that that's right, and the whole message that he wanted to put out was that there was no place for complacency. I always wonder when a politician will decree that there is a place for complacency, but I think we got the idea of what he meant. I do still think there is a case for Keir Starmer to answer here. I think he's focused very much on let's get this through the courts as quickly as possible. Let's get people sentenced who are guilty. Let's send that message. I think Labour is less comfortable with engaging what might lie behind these protests. And I don't mean in the sense at all of excusing those who've taken part, but I would see it as there still being a real job of work to do now to work out how you would stop this happening again, and also to appeal to those people who would never dream of taking part in the riots, but particularly in deprived parts of the country or feel angry about immigration levels and feel unheard, that may sympathise or find space in their politics for this kind of protest, even if they don't take part.
But Anne,
I think Keir Starmer is concerned about that, and we can see that he's beginning to get a process going. He's going to use Morgan McSweeney, who he thinks on his staff, very senior staffer, who he thinks understands this kind of problem and who's worked in communities where there's been a rise of the far right previously. So there's a sign that he kind of gets it. I do think he's been a little slow. It seems to have taken days to do things, or to message things that perhaps ought to have been said a little more clearly at the start of the week.
That's interesting. I mean, it's worth saying that Morgan McSweeney, who's very much a political Svengali behind Keir Starmer, part of his background, particularly when he was working in local government, he spent a lot of time seeing off the far right in areas like Barking and Dagenham when it was the BNP with Nick Griffin. So he's going to be an interesting voice on that. Raf, what do you think about what Anne has just said there about Starmer maybe being a bit slow to get into those things? I mean, I've got a slightly different view. You would expect me to say that. I mean, I think the danger is that if Starmer looks like he's kind of saying gives any sort of it's okay to sort of riot, and you're sending a message to anybody with a grievance, whether it's on trans rights, whether it's on go around and smash stuff up, and we'll have a conversation. I mean, that's my view on that. But what do you think about what Anne's just said?
Yeah, I think there are two important things to distinguish here, actually. I mean, I do agree with Anne that at some level, I think Keir Starmer didn't find the right idiom of sort of projection and expression to sort of speak on behalf of the civilized mainstream of the country. I think he does represent that view, but as I think we've discussed on this program before, he's a very process-driven politician. He wants to get the systems right. He was director of public prosecutions. He's thinking about the court system, and his weakness has always been slightly in what I call the kind of evangelical side of politics, just really owning the moment. And I think when the streets are on fire, when people are afraid, when there's essentially a far right fascist mob out on the rampage in some parts of the country, you really need a kind of a rhetorical intervention as well as a legal and practical one. And I think that has been his weakness as a leader. And separately, though, I do agree with you, Aisha, that it's just incredibly difficult. Look, at some stage, there is always a blurring of the line between people who feel that their community has changed. Culturally, they feel a little bit marginalized and alienated, or they believe, often nearly always wrongly, that public services are being prioritized for migrants, and that there's this kind of fizzing grievance under the surface, which clearly is something politically that needs to be addressed. But it's very hard to, in the moment when some very nasty, angry, cynical, dangerous people are exploiting that grievance, how is that the time to say, right, well, this is the grievance we're going to address? Because by default, you're then sort of giving a kind of, if not legitimacy, a certain element of license to the rioting. So that's always going to be an incredibly hard thing to do. And I just think maybe Keir Starmer has a lot of qualities as a leader and as an administrator. I think getting a rhetorical precision on this is not his strongest suit.
interesting because the narrative around the criminal justice system, and it's not just the narrative, it's the reality, is that it's been absolutely broken. There's these huge backlogs in the system. Just a couple of weeks ago, the new Justice Minister, Shabana Mahmood, said, look, because of what we've inherited, there's not enough, spaces on the male estate. And what we've seen really over the last kind of 3 days is these televised courts. We've seen kind of justice being delivered quite quickly. How important has that sort of optic been, Anne, in terms of trying to reassure people that actually the system is cranking up?
Well, I think it's important in answering the first requirement of the government, which is to show that it can respond and mete out summary justice, and also that I think one good thing about Keir Starmer's knowledge as a former director of public prosecutions is he understands the need for this to happen quickly. To be a bit testing of Labour, you could say, like, the message a few weeks ago was, we can't possibly you could be sending anyone to prison because we haven't got any space in prison. We've got to, the more liberal side of the Labour message was coming out. Well, we're not quite sure where where James Tibbs, the new prison minister, stands on this. But you have a lot of people who don't really like criminal justice cracking down very hard, followed by a message from the top saying, "Oh, we've got to get on with this." And the more people that we can get quickly, obviously convicted if they are guilty, and punished in a condign manner. So I think if you look, we've seen Keir Starmer come in with a more nuanced and often a bit of a Tory blaming narrative, and I think he realizes he can't really get away with that on
And
this one. So is it going to be the new David Blunkett? Aisha? Are we going to see a
well,
return to
it
that? I think this is a really testing question for Labour. I'd be very interested how the other panelists
well, I just want
see this.
yeah, I
There is
just
a playbook here, which
well,
was that sort of Blair kind of Blunkett era, but it doesn't fit very naturally with the tone of a lot of the government that Keir Starmer leads.
Well, Ralph, what do you think about that? Particularly, as a sort of as the Guardian's representative in many ways, because Anne's right. There's sort of been two messages. There's first of all the appointment of James Timpson, which went down really well, I have to say, across the political spectrum, and people saying this is great to have somebody who's really steeped in the system and really gets prison reform, and that prison isn't always the answer. And now there's this big emphasis on the optic of looking really tough on law and order. But at some point, those people who have got these custodial sentences will have to get released and rehabilitated. I mean, how does that all fit together as a narrative?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and it really gets to the heart of Labour's probably the biggest challenge in domestic politics, which is that you have a sort of a principled assumption about what ought to happen in public services, which could be reform and structural change, and part of that, with regard to the criminal justice system, might include a tilt towards liberalism. I mean, there are lots of people, lots of conservatives, who would ultimately recognise that just sending minor offenders off to jail for a long time, or even a short time, the prison functions as a sort of an academy of hardening criminals, and they just come out and there's the recidivism levels are through the roof, and actually prison isn't working to do what you actually want the criminal justice system to do. And so ideally you'd reform it, and there might be a liberal component to that. But entirely separate to that, and that's one set of sort of moral arguments you can have about whether you want a conservative or a liberal criminal justice system, the prisons are full, so there's just no money,
Right. Okay.
and priorities to spend on jails. People can think of other things they'd rather spend their money on, and so you had a succession. I mean, even Liz Truss, when she was the Justice Secretary, went to the Chancellor and said, what, I'm going to need some more money for prisons. You had David Gauke as a more liberal Justice Secretary saying, look, we're going to have to release people because the prisons are full. Now, those weren't arguments about rehabilitation; they were arguments about money. And
Okay.
to get to the point I'm making here very quickly, Labour are trying to say they need to reform public services. That costs money, and actually, you have to do an upfront capital spend to do the nice, bien pensant liberal things they want to do, and they're dodging that question.
Yeah, and it is interesting to see how the sort of the James Timpson view of the world will sit alongside this. I think Keir Starmer's actually won plaudits for being very, very tough and being seen to be really tough on these people. But at the end of the day, there's a big issue with money, and we all know that whenever you say reform, reform does not come without a cost. Well, look, we've got plenty.